So I'm now going to hand over the floor to Scott. Hi.
Hi, Abby. Thank you very much for the introduction. So as she was mentioning, what we're here to talk about is, well, a lot of it is about communications research, but really it's about the ever-changing world of market research and some of the ideas that we have for how to make more comprehensive studies. And part of that is really going into implicit and semi-implicit testing. So for the purposes of the webinar today, just to kind of give you a bit of an outline of what we're going to talk about, the first thing is looking forward. We have tried to identify some of the key trends and things that are going to be happening within the market research industry and figuring out how we need to adapt to make that possible so that what we do still stays relevant and that we can still connect with respondents, with consumers, and with shoppers, and some of the ramifications of those changes and those trends that we're going to be facing. The second thing we did is, so that was looking forward, but we also wanted to look backwards and to see what's already out there, especially in the realm of implicit testing. And so what we're going to do is just kind of summarize really two of the main types of implicit testing that has been out there and that has gained some traction, and talk about some of the pros and the cons of each one. And then what we're here really to talk about then is, taking those two things into account, what type of research can we do to kind of bridge emotional and rational and make sure that what we have will get a comprehensive understanding of the decision journey that consumers are making, as well as doing it in a way that is actionable and that is commercially viable. So with that in mind, like I said, let's take a start at going forward. And so what we talk about here is 2020, but really what we mean is the near future for market research. And if you've been a part of any of our webinar series in the past, or if you've been to any conferences, especially in Europe, you might have seen our chairman, Dirk, give a presentation about some of the key trends moving forward for market research. And so I'm not here to summarize and go through all of these, but there are three ones in particular that we want to talk about today that really impacted the research that we're going to be sharing with you. And so we'll just kind of quickly touch on these three, and then I'll go into each one in a bit more detail. But the first one that we have here is the need for speed. We're seeing that consumers, that shoppers, they want everything immediately. And so as researchers, we need to adapt to that. Then there's also this kind of growing proliferation of mobile. And so what that means is that we, of course, need to start making surveys and start communicating with shoppers and with consumers on their mobile devices. It's no longer enough to just focus in on in-person IDIs or to be looking at desktop types of surveys online. And then lastly, and this one is here really at the root of what we're talking about, is this idea of bridging the rational and emotional drivers together and making sure that whatever we do, the type of research that we have, is really comprehensive and make sure that you cover both of those, because, I mean, let's face it, if you're making a decision, it really is both rational and emotional most of the time. So as we were saying, the first thing that we want to talk about is this need for speed. And if you think about, if you're just, let's say you're walking around, you're finding that people are always on their devices, or they're always sitting in front of their computer, and they want something that comes to them immediately. I think about if I'm trying to watch a video, if I click play and it buffers for more than 2 seconds, more than 3 seconds, I get angry and I usually switch to go watch something else. And that's what type of stuff that we're facing. And that's in terms of buffering internet speeds, but in the same way, if you're trying to search for something, you want that search to happen quickly. And what we're seeing is that people are looking to have something happen within about 3 clicks. If you can't get that instant gratification and you don't get something happening immediately, you probably lost that person and they're moving on to something different. And that's not really any different than with market research. If I think about when I first started with SKIM, we were doing studies that might last, 8 weeks for a simple study, 12 weeks for maybe a complex study. And now we're talking more overnight research, or maybe one to 2 weeks for a simpler study. Maybe a more complex study is going to be 4 or 5 weeks, but everything is compressing. If we were to come to, let's say, a client, or if a client was to come to us and say, hey, we have 12, 13 weeks for a study, honestly, that's never going to happen anymore. Everything is condensing the amount of time that we have to do something. And in order to make sure that we stay relevant and that the offerings are applicable, then not only from our side, but from the side of a client or from the side of a respondent, we need to adapt our processes and change the way that we work so that the ability to provide those insights really matters and comes to fruition. The next insight that we were talking about research going forward is this idea of how mobile devices are really taking over the world. There was some interesting research done by, it was Google and Ipsos back in 2015, and one of the things that they found was that in the US, 82% of smartphone users say that they will consult their phone, so they'll pull out their phone and start doing some research, even when they're in a store. So this isn't people who are, sitting on their couch and doing research to buy something off of a website, but these are people actually at the shelf where they could be picking up a product, but they're actually doing research online. That might be, price comparisons, or it might be looking up reviews, but they're always going to be using those devices. I was actually just on a trip over the long holiday weekend, and I was talking with one of my friends about how now there are times where I actually want to be reading a magazine, or I want to be reading a physical book, because I just feel like I don't want to be the person who's always on my device. So you're even seeing people are more conscious of the fact that they're always on the device. It's always there. It's kind of attached to the hip or attached to the hand. And that's just thinking about from a consumer perspective. And if you look then at going to digital too, what we're seeing is that there's some estimates now that in 2020, so about 4 years from now, 50% of all consumer packaged goods are going to be bought online. And so that means that we need to start communicating with these people, not just online, but also on their mobile devices. And I mean, if you just focus in on something like a developing world, like the developing countries, the mobile devices are actually starting to take over more so than something like a computer, because it's easier for them to get those mobile devices. And while this is really good and really helpful, it has both pros and cons. If you think about some of the limitations to it, then we're not talking about people taking a survey on a 15 or even a 17-inch monitor where we can put up 100 products at once and ask them which one they would shop. We're talking about a screen that might only be, let's say, 5 inches big, maybe at the biggest. And so what that means is that we need to kind of condense that down, our surveys and the inputs that we have, so that they're seeing everything on one small screen. And the other thing about that is you're going to have a lot bigger limitations in terms of time. As a person, we're kind of trained now that we can sit in front of our computer for an hour on end, and we can take a 20-minute survey at our desktop or at our laptop because we're used to that. But in the same way that we're used to doing that on a laptop, we're also not used to doing that on a mobile device. And so rather than building a 15 to 20-minute survey where you kind of compress and ask as many questions as you can think of, we're probably facing around a limit of about 5 minutes. And so what that means is that we need to limit the type of questions that we ask and really focus in on what matters the most. And those are some, I guess, let's say some limitations to this proliferation of mobile devices. But at the same time, it's not all bad. We're finding that there's a lot of positive things that are coming out of this too. And one of the biggest ones is that we're able to now communicate with people in the moment. Whereas before, when it was only on desktop, or let's say it was only through talking to somebody in a central location, you were most often asking about something that had happened in the past. Hey, you purchased, let's say, shampoo in the last 3 months. Maybe that was 6 weeks ago, but talk to us about that process. Or you purchased a computer 8 weeks ago. What did you do? What was the main advertisement that really reached you that made you want to purchase, let's say, Apple over Acer or something along those lines? Now, as we're talking with mobile, that's not really a limitation anymore. We can start to talk to people in the moment. With geocaching, we can find out that you're actually in a store right now. You might be in a Walmart. You might be in an Albert Heijn. You're there. What are you doing? Why are you reacting this way? Maybe flip the camera around, take a video of what you're doing so we can see the way that you're shopping, or record your thoughts as you're going through out loud, so that way we know in the moment what's happening. And so while there are limitations to this, there's a lot of positive things that are coming out of it as well. And according to Pew Research, one of the things that we're seeing is that actually 76% of smartphone users are using social networking sites. And so here we just have a couple of examples of them that you might be familiar with, some of them maybe not. But if you think back to when computers first came out and the mouse was added, a lot of people didn't really know how to use it. And so one of the things that I think it was Windows did that was really smart was they invented the game Minesweeper. And what that taught you to do was how to left click and right click to find out more information. So you could right click on a little box to add a flag to mark that you thought that there might be a bomb there, or you could left click on it to say there's not a bomb there, and it would open up more options for you. And that game was created to teach you how to use a mouse. But what we're seeing now for mobile is that actually these social networks are what are teaching us how to use it. So you're no longer thinking left click, right click, maybe scroll up and down the wheel on your mouse, but now consumers are being taught to zoom in and pinch out. They're swiping left or right on Tinder, or on Instagram they're double tapping a picture to say that they like it, or on Facebook they're single clicking on something to click the thumbs up and to say that they like it. And so consumers are now interacting with these devices in a whole different way than they had been with computers in the past. And what that means for us is that when we start thinking about how do we develop surveys and how do we develop, let's say, an app or a platform where we can talk to them, we need to take these things into account and come up with different ways to make a design so that it happens in an intuitive way. Then the last insight here that I want to talk about, again, talking about moving forward, and this is, as I mentioned earlier, really one of the most important ones, is this idea of bridging rational and emotional drivers. At SKIM here, we consider ourselves to be experts at modeling consumer decision behavior. And in the past, within market research, and I mean, admittedly, within SKIM too, we really focused in on the rational side of things, oftentimes because that's the easier one to get. You can say, hey, we see that you purchased product X. Why did you purchase it? And then rationally, you can go through and kind of explain it. But what that leaves out then is the emotional side, or the subconscious things that are going on. We know that they're going on, but a lot of times they're harder to measure. And really, though, if you want to get a comprehensive view of it, you need to be able to do both. And luckily, there's been a lot of advances in cognitive psychology that have enabled us to figure out what is going on the emotional side. So really then, the challenge, though, is how do we take, let's say, the rational side of things that we already know and we've been measuring for quite a while, and we can do fairly quickly and economically, with the, let's say, the emotional side and the emotional or cognitive measures that sometimes might be a little more complex or might be more expensive and time-consuming, but we want to make sure that we still do get both of them, because that's the real truth. That's what really matters. And I think, as researchers, as most of you on this webinar are, you're probably familiar with the book Thinking Fast and Slow from Daniel Kahneman, so I'm not going to spend the next 10 minutes going through this or anything like that, but we do just want to give a quick recap of what this is, because this really is important to the type of research that we're going to show you in a few minutes. So System 1 thinking is the side of the brain that is more fast or automatic, and it tends to be a bit more associative in nature. So this is where if I were to ask you, what color is grass? You wouldn't have to go through and go outside to look at the grass and figure out what it is. You would probably just naturally say green. Or if I were to ask you, what color is the sky? Maybe in London you might say gray, but for most of the world, just probably instinctively you would say, oh, it's blue. And that's really the more faster subconscious level of things that are in there. It's kind of trained into your brain, and you don't really need to overthink it so much. The System 2 side of things, this is really the more slower, logical, and really the rational side of things. This is where you get a complex problem, or maybe it's something that you're just really unsure of. This is where this is the turtle, I guess you would say. It's a slower process. So rather than asking you what color is the sky, I might ask you, hey, what's the answer to 8 times 35? Unless you're an absolute genius, you probably don't know that off the top of your head. And so you need to think through it a little bit more, and that's what we have for System 2. But really, most decisions, unless it's something that fast or maybe that complicated, most decisions are going to account for both of those, especially when it's something like, let's say, a shopping decision, where as much as we want to think that we're rational about it, there's always that emotional pull to it. And so you really need to account for both of these. So that is a quick summary then of, as we mentioned, the way that we see things moving forward. And really, those are the 3 elements that we want to take into account. But as I said before, we also wanted to look backwards and see what type of testing had already been done, especially in regards to the implicit or the System 1 way of thinking. And so what we're going to do now is just kind of quickly go over 2 different ways of testing and talk about some of the pros and cons of them. One of them, and what you see on the screen here, is what we call an implicit association test. And one of the things that you do for this is you show, let's say, a brand, or you show words that describe an emotion or something like that, and ask them to quickly move them to one side or the other. And actually, if you're familiar with Malcolm Gladwell's book Blink, then you probably know quite a lot about this methodology, because he really introduces and goes through a lot of the information there. But what we can do with this type of test is you can use the reaction time, and you can use the way that the respondent or the individual has categorized, let's say, the brands and also the emotional words and descriptors to start to understand the associations that people are having with them. And it's something that can be really good at capturing the, let's say, the non-conscious element of decision making. Another type of test that has been done a lot in the past is what's called effective priming. And this is something where, let's say we show a stimuli, so the screen on the left here, you see, we show you Coca-Cola, and then we take it away, and then we put up a word, and let's say happy. And you start to then group these based off of, what you see here is move it to the right, positive, you move it to the left if it's negative. But we can use the reaction time to how quickly you do this to understand the relative strength of the associations that they have between, in this example, a brand or maybe a product with those emotions. The faster you move it, the stronger those associations are. And what we have there with the implicit association testing, but also the effective priming, are two techniques that are really good at measuring what we're calling the system one way of thinking. And actually, to be honest, they work very well on a mobile device as well. If you remember the two screens that we have up now, it can be pretty simplistic, which means that it could go on a mobile device. But unfortunately, in practice, they might not be as applicable as we would want them to be from a commercial standpoint. And two of the reasons are that a lot of these measurements that come out of these are going to be relative. So you might be able to say that we're grouping certain things together, but it can be pretty difficult to get an absolute score out of them. And then the other thing, too, is that it often doesn't meet the requirement that we talked about with the first trend, which is that need for speed. In order to do this effectively, a lot of times you need massive samples, and while that can be good because it makes it very robust, it's also something that we see, especially in some of the less developed countries, where it's not like we have a panel of 6-7 million people the way that you might across some regions, and so it's not necessarily something that can be done very easily. So then when you combine the sort of future-facing way of what are the trends and how do we need to adapt to stay current with those trends, as well as some of these implicit versions that, while great in theory, might not necessarily be as applicable for a commercial standpoint, we sort of faced a challenge of, we know that the implicit testing techniques are really useful, and we know that they can be great and provide a lot of insight in terms of system one thinking. But we still want this to be practical, and we still want it to be actionable and commercially viable to the point where we can give our clients and we can understand some great consumer insights out of it in a relatively fast and still, let's say, affordable way. And so after doing a whole lot of research and a whole lot of testing, what we're very proud to share now are two different techniques that we have from a quantitative standpoint. And we'll go through each one of those two techniques, and then also, it's not just enough to say, hey, this product concept or this advertisement works very well or works better than the other one, but we also have then a way that we can gain some qualitative insights from it. And just one of the things I'll pause to say here is that, as I mentioned, we did a lot of research into this, into what else is out there, and then also a lot of research and validation into these techniques. So our VP of methodology, who resides in the US, has done a whole lot of work there, and we've made a lot of technique changes and pilots and everything to make sure that what we have now and what we're sharing with you is fully validated and something that can be executed on very quickly. So the first module, the first technique that we have, it's honestly a pretty quick swiping technique. Is really the roots behind it, or what a respondent or what a consumer would see. But what this has is we put up, let's say, a product concept like you see here for Corona, or we put up a brand or a product claim or something along those lines, and ask them a very binary decision. Do you like it or do you not like it? Swipe it right if you do, swipe it left if you don't. And this goes back to, remember we were talking a couple of minutes ago about how people are being trained on their mobile devices, and rather than necessarily clicking or dragging or dropping, they're really being trained to kind of swipe in, swipe out, zoom in, zoom out, things like that. And so this takes advantage of that. And what you can do is, because we're showing products in isolation, so you see here let's say a concept for Corona. We're not showing it, you notice, with a concept for Guinness or Coors Light or anything like that, but it's really one concept here by itself. And by focusing in on something in isolation like this, what you get is a much more emotional response, because they're not evaluating product A versus product B versus product C, but it's just, here's a product or here's a concept, do you like it or no? And you go through very quickly. So you get to that much more fast kind of system one way of thinking. And what this is really useful for is thinking about how does let's say an input, so in this case a Corona ad, stand out amongst all of the clutter. Because what you do is you throw pretty much as many types of things on here as you could see. So this might be a Corona ad first, then Guinness, then Coors Light, then BrewDog, or whatever it might be. We'll throw them all on there one at a time and ask people to go through very quickly. So it's not that they're sitting here and evaluating for 5 minutes for each one, but they're encouraged to go through quickly. And if they're not going through, then we put up a prompt that says, hey, are you there? So that way they're not over-rationalizing things. And once somebody goes through this, in the back end, we have two key metrics that we use to evaluate this. One is, as I mentioned before, the very binary decision of, did you swipe to the right? Yes, or swipe left? No. And this really measures the affect towards that stimuli. And it gives a very absolute score out of it. So what we talked about before, where a lot of times, unfortunately, things can be rather relative in scoring. This gives a very absolute, because it really is just a binary decision. But where this also really gets interesting is by taking into the effect the reaction time. If you think about, if that Corona ad pops up and you immediately go to the right because you absolutely love Corona, you're not overthinking. It's just, oh, Corona, I love it, and you go to the right. Or if let's say you absolutely hate Corona, you go straight to the left. And so it really measures conviction of how fast you're moving, because we found that if you're taking a little bit while longer, and let's say it took you half a second for the first ad but 5 seconds for the second ad, that means that you're evaluating the second one more because it's not hitting its home, either positive or negative, but it's not hitting its home as much as the other one. So you don't have as strong of a conviction for that. And so by piecing these two things together, and there's a lot of stuff in the back end, but these are two of the main metrics. By piecing these two things together, you can get a really comprehensive understanding of, at an emotional level, at a really raw kind of system one level, what is happening. And just to kind of go over a couple of different areas where we think that this could apply. You talk about messages and ads, ideas or concept screenings, pretty much anything where an old rating system would come into effect, this can be used for a lot. And as well as actually segmentations, so consumer segmentations, how do they react to something, or even trackers, where if you run, let's say you were to run an advertisement over the course of 6 months, and you want to put it in with all the current advertisements, but then a month from now, let's say a bunch of your competitors have changed, and so you keep the ad in, change the competitors, and want to see how it's going over time. You could even turn this into a tracker we've seen as well. So there's a lot of different areas that this could apply. The second, then, quantitative technique that we have is actually looking more towards the system two, or the rational way of doing things. So what we said for the first technique was that we show everything in isolation because we don't want people making trade-offs. We just want them to see at a very kind of intuitive level, do they like it or not? So the second way that we do is going really towards making those trade-offs and trying to get more towards the rational response. And so if you know something, what is often called product wars or messaging wars, it's really a concept similar to that, where we'll show two different stimuli at once. And so in this case, you might have a product, a marketing claim, and a price. It could just be a product, or it could just be a claim. It could be anything as long as they're relatively consistent, and asking them to make a trade-off. So oftentimes this will be purchase. So which one of these two products would you purchase? Could be appeal. The metric itself can change, but the methodology behind it stays the same. And if you run any virtual shopping exercises, or even physical shopping exercises, where you're asking people to go to a shelf and make a decision, this is very similar to that, except it's in a bit of a stripped-down version, really built, again, for that mobile world that we're continuing to go to. And so with this technique, we repeat this over time and ask them to make trade-offs between a bunch of different products or a bunch of different advertisements. And then what this boils down to in the back end is, again, two key metrics. So similar to the first technique, reaction time plays a big role here to measure conviction. So what we showed before was, I think it was Tide versus Gain, and Tide, for those of you, I'm American, and Tide is it's a big brand in the U.S. and it's known for having that orange bottle. So let's say that I am a diehard Tide fan, and you continue to show those products. I might always click on Tide, regardless of what else is there. And so you know that for me, I have a very strong feeling for Tide, and I have strong conviction. Otherwise, if you start taking a little bit longer, you're kind of rationalizing the decision a little bit more, and that means that your conviction that you have for that might be a little bit less. But the other absolute metric that you get out of this is the product choice. So in the same way that there was a binary reaction for the first one of swipe left or swipe right, here you have a decision of which product did you choose. And let's say that we show product A and B, and I choose A, and then you show product B and C, and I choose B. What you get out of that is that I prefer A over B, B over C, which means that I also prefer A over C. So you can also start to get a ranking to this, and as we talked about, measuring purchase decision, measuring appeal, whatever it might be. Then on the back end, all of that kind of feeds into this simulator to ultimately build out a market simulator that can help you to combine all of these things together to maximize impact, the same way that you would get for, let's say, a traditional pricing study or a traditional line optimization study. You can still get to the simulator. It's just in a simplified version for the mobile world. And then when we think about the type of application areas that this has, you have messages and ads, again, because these are things that you can start to compare against competition, package design, or any time really where you're trying to optimize your product assortment, the line of products that you have out there, or even making pricing changes. These types of things where you want to start making trade-offs can be measured really effectively with this technique. So that is the two kind of quantitative techniques that we talked about, but as I mentioned before, there's also a bit of a qualitative nature that you want to get, because it's not just enough to say that I prefer one thing over the other, but you also want to understand why that's happening. And so what we have now is it's actually really interesting. To be honest, I really like this. But it's almost like a skin that we can put over a product concept or an advertisement. And we can ask people to say, hey, this was your top performing concept. Why did you like it? And it allows a respondent to go through and click on any aspect of it that you want. And then a little pop-up appears, and they can type in what they say is the reason that they like it or the reason that they don't like it. For past research, a lot of times what's happened for, let's say, a concept like this Rattler ad is that you need to break it down into elements. So you might only be able to click on the bottle or on the lemon or maybe the claim, but that's really one specific element. But now with this, as I mentioned, it's kind of like a skin that you can put over it. They can really click anywhere. And what comes out of it is it looks like eye tracking, but it's a heat map so that you can see what's the most effective things here. And so, as an example, we have refreshingly curious beer as the claim for this, and you see that people are focusing really in on the word refreshingly. What that means is that, let's say this were to be the concept that you wanted to go forward with, the curious beer isn't really driving it, so maybe that means that you want to keep in this idea of refreshing because it ties in with the ice and everything on there, but you could probably use that other space to put in maybe a couple of different descriptive words or something to make this pop even more so than what you currently have. And when you start to tie in those two quantitative techniques that measure the system one, where you're focusing on really just at a binary decision, do you like this, yes or no? Then you start to look at the system two, where you start making those trade-offs the same way that you do at a shelf, or even when shopping through search results on a website. And then you tie in this qualitative nature as well to understand why and to figure out how you can optimize it even further. What you get is a really comprehensive understanding of what consumers are doing and what their mental process is as they're going through and shopping. And then just to kind of wrap this all up here, one of the things that we like to do is we always like to ask for feedback from the respondents themselves after they go through our surveys, just to see how things are going. Are there ways that we can improve this? And to be honest, it's been really interesting to see the responses that we're getting this. People are talking about how it's a fun survey and it feels like a game and it's so short and it's built for mobile friendly that I feel like I can take a lot of these. I don't mind. It's not a burden, and they're actually enjoying it, which is for us, it's really rewarding and really nice to see, because one of the things that we and as well is that the more engaged that a respondent is, the better the results you're going to get. And so for us to see that type of feedback is coming in, it's honestly very encouraging. But so what we just shared with you now is really the looking forward. What do we see as the trends within market research, and how do we need to adapt to stay relevant within those? Then also looking back at some of the implicit tests that have already been out there and figuring out what are the pros and cons for those, and then wrapping all those up into the type of research that we have come out with about a new way that we can measure System 1 and System 2 to really get that comprehensive understanding of what a consumer or what a shopper is doing when making any type of decision. But I'd like to ask, if you look through this, you want to find out more, please let us know. Or if you have seen any of this and you think, oh, maybe there's a different way that we could use this, or a way that maybe in your business that we haven't thought of that could be used, please reach out. This is something that myself and my colleague based in New York, Sean, are both very passionate about and would love to continue to discuss with you further. So with that, I will wrap up, and please do let me know if you have any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Scott. We do have I have one or two questions here, and I mean, feel free to keep putting your questions in, but I'm going to say we go ahead and wrap up since we're just 1 or 2 minutes over time. I'm going to forward your questions over to Scott, and he'll get back to you personally. Thank you all for attending. I think it's a super interesting method, and indeed it's fitting exactly for the mobile reality we have right now. So I'm excited to see where this goes, and I hope you are too. So I'll actually be sharing the slides and the recording with all of you within a couple of days. So if you're also excited about this method, please feel free to share it with your colleagues. And you can also go to skimgroup.com/webinars, or just visit SKIMgroup and click on the main menu under webinars. And you can sign up there for updates on our upcoming sessions. We actually have a session coming out next month, well, already this month at the end of May, which is about how to do conjoint on low-tech phones so that you can find out more about lower-income consumers. So please feel free to go ahead and sign up for that. Thank you once again all for joining, and we look forward to hearing from you soon. Bye.